Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Ringing Raconteur. This is a discussion of Stephen Crane's short story, The Blue Hotel. It's an excellent story. It hits this midpoint between literary realism and literary naturalism, and then just sort of rocks between them throughout the story in a really fascinating way, in a way that Crane, I think, did about as well as any writer from United States literature. It's probably my favorite of his short stories. Maybe not my favorite of all of his works, but of his short stories. It's really good. I'm going to include a link to the full text in the description box below, so if you've never read it, I highly recommend that you take the chance to when you have time. It's about 30 pages in a mass market paperback, which gives you an idea of what the time commitment would be. So, like I said, it hits that realism, naturalism midpoint and then kind of hovers between them. So we have a realistic setting that's quickly sketched. We have characters presented in a way that tries to capture what their dialogue would sound like. So Crane, like a number of other writers who want to affect the reality of characters, replaces usually vowels within words of dialogue so that when you read it, if you read it phonetically, you get the sound of how that character would be pronouncing that word. So characters from different regions or from this specific time period, they speak a little bit differently within the dialogue, even as they converse. We have a cowboy, an Easterner, someone from the Eastern United States, a character who's called the Swede. We have the proprietor of the Blue Hotel, Scully, who periodically speaks with a brogue, particularly when he starts to lose control or lose his temper. And so that's a quick technique that we've seen in a number of other story writers. Faulkner, Zora, Neale, Hurston, both of them did that. Toni Morrison, writing later on in the 20th century, made the same choice with dialogue, and I think to good effect. So to give an idea of sort of how Crane sketches the setting, I'm going to read the first paragraph and I'm going to contrast it with one later on in the story, and we'll see kind of how he uses the setting sketch to emphasize a change in the story. The Palace Hotel at Fort Romper was painted a light blue, a shade that is on the legs of a kind of heron, causing the bird to declare its position against any background. The Palace Hotel then was always screaming and howling in a way that made the dazzling winter landscape of Nebraska seem only a gray, swampish hush. It stood alone on the prairie, and when the snow was falling, the town 200 yards away was not visible. But when the traveler alighted at the railway station, he was obliged to pass the Palace Hotel before he could come upon the company of low clapboard houses which composed Fort Romper, and it was not to be thought that any traveler could pass the Palace Hotel without looking at it. And so we have this setting sketched, and then when we get inside the hotel, we're told what it looks like. We know there's a big fire, people are gathered around the fire, and you get this sense of it's winter in Nebraska. It's cold. Characters want to be close to the fire. One character is described as almost like just blocking the fire out because he wants all of it. But that description of the Palace Hotel is fascinating. If you've never been through the central United States, it's completely flat, which as someone from Arizona just absolutely shocked me the first time I drove through. I was like, what is this? It is completely flat. So depending on the time of year and the weather, it's white or gray or green or like yellowish or brown, and it's just flat. And then you have the blue sky as a line above it, and that's it. And so you have this particular shade of blue just blotting out like as a block sitting there. And I want to contrast that with later on, after a lot of action has transpired in the story, we get this passage. The Swede found a saloon. In front of it, an indomitable red light was burning, and the snowflakes were made blood color as they flew through the circumscribed territory of the lamp's shining. And so, when you contrast those sentences with, you have a red light, and it's not a house of prostitution. But there's a red light there, and it's turned the snow to blood. Whereas earlier we had this blue hotel that almost seems like it's like on a cloud or in the sky or something. It is above the landscape. It's more alive than the landscape, the gray swamp hush. And then here we have this red light that has turned the snow to blood, and really frightening. So as I had mentioned, the characters speak with different dialogue. Now we have an interesting piece here where we have three characters who arrived on the train, and Scully convinces them to come to his hotel. He's a really energetic businessman. And so Scully gets a cowboy, an Easterner, and then this character who's called the Swede to come over to his hotel and stay the night. and we don't really interact with very many other characters. We have those three characters. We have Scully and we have his son Johnny. Scully has a wife and some daughters who sort of pop up. There's a farmer who pops up, and then the Swede interacts with some characters at the end. But those those three travelers, Scully and his son Johnny, are really it for the story. As I had mentioned, they have very slightly vocalization like differences within the dialogue. So the cowboy has just a slight difference from the Easterner or Johnny. Scully speaks just a little bit differently, and then as he gets frustrated, his brogue starts to come out more and more. And the Swede is just terrified. It's like a Greek tragedy when the Swede walks in. He's not comfortable being in this hotel. It's very obvious he's not happy. He wants to leave. Scully's like, no, nobody can leave. I won't have it said that a guest at my hotel was forced out by unkind, by my son or by other guests who were unkind to him. This is a square deal place. And so he basically follows the Swede upstairs and goes and gets alcohol and is trying to ply him with whiskey, and so the Swede becomes even more uncomfortable. He talks about how he feels like he's gonna be killed in this hotel, and the other characters are joking like, "What's the deal with him?" You would think the Easterner, as sort of like the dude, would be out of place, would be the one who's uncomfortable and surprised by it, but it really is this character called the Swede, and that becomes important at the end of the story. And so at one point they finally get the Swede, as he gets this liquid courage, starts to become a little bit obstreperous, where the other characters are almost not wanting to deal with him, but he demands that people play cards with him. And so initially the cowboy is discussed as he always hits the table when he has a good play. And after the Swede has had has had his I don't want to say outburst, where he's been frightened and become very uncomfortable, and then he goes upstairs and has whiskey with Scully and comes back down. The cowboy's not hitting the table with the cards anymore. He's not having fun, in a sense. Everybody can tell there's a difference. And so the Swede accuses Johnny of cheating, and now it becomes this story around, there's going to be a fight between them. This is they've made it clear this is not the Wild West, so there's not going to be a gunfight, which is what they thought. Maybe the Swede thought he was in that type of situation. It's not going to be a gunfight, but Johnny and the Swede are now going to go fight. And so we have this passage of the fight between them. It's wildly uncomfortable. The contestants had not stripped off any clothing. Each was in his ordinary attire. Their fists were up, and they eyed each other in a calm that had the elements of leonine cruelty in it. During this pause, the Easterner's mind, like a film, took lasting impressions of the three men, the iron-nerved master of the ceremony, the Swede, pale, motionless, terrible, and Johnny, serene yet ferocious, brutish yet heroic. The entire prelude had in it a tragedy greater than the tragedy of action, and this aspect was accentuated by the long, mellow cry of the blizzard as it sped the tumbling and wailing flakes into the black abyss of the south. "Now," said Scully. The two combatants leaped forward and crashed together like bullets. There was heard the cushioned sound of blows and of a curse squeezing out from between the tight teeth of one. And it's a very intense description of the fight. It is very natural and real, in the sense of these aren't glancing blows. The characters really physically are violent towards each other, and the other characters around the cowboy start screaming, "Kill him, kill him!" And so it can be a very unsettling story to read at the least. So after this is now sort of where the spoilers jump in. After the Swede has won the fight, he then decides he's going to leave. He goes off to that saloon where there's the blood red snow, and continues to sort of lash out. And mind you, this is a guy who is new to the town. He's a stranger, and he's felt harassed the entire story. He lashes out and ends up demanding that strangers drink with him. They don't want to drink with him. And so in the next fight that ensues, he gets stabbed and killed. And so we end with this section where the cowboy and the Easterner are off somewhere else. They get the newspaper reports about the gambler who had stabbed the Swede, and they talk about it, and then the Easterner suddenly changes our entire perspective of what seemed like a very realist, naturalist story. Suddenly takes on this other meaning when the Easterner has his final lines, because he shares that the fight between the Swede and Johnny occurred because the Swede accused Johnny of cheating. And then nobody really liked the Swede, so they, were fine with having this fight occur. They didn't want the Swede to win the fight. When the Swede won the fight, he left the hotel. And the Easterner shares, to the cowboy, he was cheating. And he has this line. He goes, I saw him, I know it, I saw him. And I refused to stand up and be a man. I let the Swede fight it out alone. And you were simply puffing around the place and wanting to fight. And then old Scully himself. We were all in it. This poor gambler isn't even a noun. He's kind of an adverb. Every sin is the result of a collaboration. We, 5 of us, have collaborated in the murder of this Swede. Usually there are from a dozen to 40 people really involved in every murder. But in this case, it seems to be only 5 men. You, I, Johnny, old Scully, and that fool of an unfortunate gambler came merely as a culmination, the apex of a human movement, and gets all the punishment. The cowboy, injured and rebellious, cried out blindly into this fog of mysterious theory. Well, I didn't do anything, did I? And so I think that's where we see this edge now towards naturalism, where there is this social aspect to the story, this idea of not just here's a real account of what happened in the story, but here's a real account of what happened in the story. And then the naturalist tradition is to push around and say, here's why that happened. Here are the social forces, the scientific forces that caused those events to happen in that particular way. And that's an important difference, I think. That it gets at some of those ideas around writers like Guy de Maupassant or Emile Zola, where they try to show that bad things happen. The happiest ending in a Stephen Crane story or in most Guy de Maupassant stories, short of like Madame de Tellier's Establishment, the best ending you can hope for is to just survive to the end. There are almost no happy endings. And that's what we see here, is that it's not just that this happened, but that this happened in a way that was impersonal, that people made decisions that forced it to happen. They chose a sense of tribalism, in a sense, against this character, the Swede, and that's why he was doomed, and he knew he was doomed when he came in and saw the strangers arrayed against him. There's a passage earlier in the story that shares that idea. He might have been this is the Swede, in a deserted village. We picture the world as thick with conquering and elate humanity. But here, with the bugles of the tempest pealing, it was hard to imagine a peopled earth. One viewed the existence of man then as a marvel and conceded a glamour of wonder to these lice, which were caused to cling to a whirling, fire-smoked, ice-locked, disease-stricken, space-lost bulb. The conceit of man was explained by this storm to be the very engine of life. One was a coxcomb, not to die in it. And I think that's where this story can feel very pessimistic. But there's an aspect to it that doesn't have to feel that way. The Easterner points out, I saw all of this, I made a choice. So it's not just that the Easterner was forced to make that choice. The Swede may have been trapped in the circumstances, but the Easterner wasn't. And a different decision on the Easterner's part changes those circumstances. And I think that's a key difference for Crane. Crane's not quite pessimistic to say, this was deterministic, it was going to happen this way, it had to happen this way. Rather, he shows a character recognizing in the Easterner, it might have had to happen that way in that sense, but I could have changed it. The cowboy doesn't recognize that, but the Easterner does. And so I think that becomes a very important piece. As I had mentioned, writers like Mark Twain sort of were forebears in that literary realism here in the United States. Guy de Maupassant's stories. I would add, there is an element of Euripides where you sort of can tell the ending in the first page or first 2 pages, and then it's sort of like the way we get there. The Nebraska setting is very reminiscent of Willa Cather and some of her stories, particularly A Lost Lady. And then if you're looking for one that sort of jumps, like a jumping off point from this, I would go with The Gilded Six-Bits by Zora Neale Hurston. It's not as dark or pessimistic, but it hits some similar themes. So that was The Blue Hotel by Stephen Crane, and let me know if you've read it. Maybe you have a different interpretation than I do. And stay safe, everybody. Best.